Hey class, so we're going to talk about chapter 7, which is all about responsibilities and what are the ethics involved with your responsibilities to others. So, to start with, how do you define what your responsibilities to others are? And there's not one definition that fits for every single person in the world. And it's really going to depend on what your relationship is with the other party. So, for example, they say that, my relationship with my child and my responsibilities to my child are completely different than my responsibilities to a coworker or to my neighbors or etc., just a stranger. All those responsibilities are a little bit different because those are different relationships I have with those people. And some have obviously higher responsibilities than others. So we kind of talk about what are the responsibilities from an employee to their employer? Because right, we're talking about business ethics here. So as an employee, what do you owe to your employer? And what do you have to do? And one of the broad definitions the book suggests is that for most of the part, you kind of have to do what they ask, right? Like so they're employing you, they'll give you directions on what to do for your job, and you kind of have to do those things. But obviously there's limits on those, and you have to be within reason on what to do. Obviously, they can't just ask you to do something that's illegal or unethical. That wouldn't work. So it has to be reasonable. And employees aren't always just don't just have responsibilities to their employers. They can also have responsibilities to other people too. So just because you're under contract, you're working for an employer, that doesn't mean that all other responsibilities cease to exist and you only have responsibilities to the employer. You still have responsibilities to other people. Like if you're a manager, you might have responsibilities to stakeholders. Um, I think everybody involved in business have responsibilities to customers and to provide for their customers, and also as society as a whole. Like we talk about the corporate social responsibility, and that's a big responsibility, and not every business takes that up. But I think it is, if we're talking about the ethics of it, I think it is ethical to be a responsible part of society, and you have responsibilities to be a good member of society, I guess. Okay, so next they dive into trust, which I think is kind of a waste of paper, honestly, in this book. We understand what trust is. I mean, you guys are college age students. I hope you know what trust is and what it means to trust somebody. But I do think it is kind of interesting to think about how much trust we do put in the system and the society that we have for especially when it comes to business, right? So anytime you shop or make a transaction or sell something or buy something, there is a lot of trust involved in that relationship. And a lot of that trust does stem from the laws that we have in place to protect consumers and to protect business people. So there are laws that help guide that trust, but we're still be very trusting. Like I'm hiring somebody to put up a fence in the backyard, and I'm trusting that person to do the job, and they're trusting that I'm going to pay them at the end of it. And hope that if everything goes well, both those things will happen. So they move on then to talk about kind of a narrow view of employee responsibility. And they very quickly bring up a common law concept called it's an agent principle concept. And what it means in business law is, or I think it can be applied outside business law, but in law terms, it's basically a relationship where you hire someone to act as an agent on your behalf. So the agent is who you've hired, and that agent, you're trusting them, and they're expected to do things on your behalf in a way that you want them done. So, for instance, this would mean like your employees have a duty to act on behalf of the employer and the employer's best interests. And this doesn't mean that like I said, they don't have other responsibilities. So just because you are an agent of someone as an employee, or even there's other agents too, like people who hire a lawyer, that the lawyer is an agent of that, of like if it was me hiring a lawyer, I'm the principal, the lawyer's my agent. So they're acting on behalf of me because they have the expertise and the knowledge that I don't, and I need to contract with them for their expertise. This is a little bit described as like a master and servant relationship, like the agent must do everything I say and all my demands. That's not really how it works now. And obviously we've moved away from servants. I believe so. In most of the world, I think. Um, there's not a lot of servants now. We pay people for work. So, and different agents have different levels of responsibility. Obviously, a low-level employee doesn't have the same level of responsibility as a managerial person, because a manager has like discretion to act on behalf of the business, and so their responsibilities as an agent are much greater than like what a line worker might have who just has to follow directions. There's a difference there, but they both are acting on behalf of the employer. So what else do they talk about? They talk about, oh, they give a good description of kind of what an employee should have to follow. And that description is that you should obey orders when it is job related, when it is a reasonable request. Obviously, they can't make you go to the moon or something. I don't know. It has to be reasonable, something you can reasonably do, and something that does not violate legal or ethical duties. So that's the description they give on what employee responsibility is to their employer should be. And I think this all makes sense. Like you shouldn't have to do things out or outside of your job. Obviously, you can't do things that you can't do, so it has to be reasonable. And obviously, you should not violate the law. The ethical duties is where it gets a little gray, because if it's not legal, but your employer wants you to do it, but it goes against your ethics, how does that work? So that's an interesting question to kind of ponder over. Next, they talk about a little bit about how much, what like level of work that you owe your employer. And this is a big topic in, I think, every work environment, is how much effort should you put in, honestly. So I think it's tough to say, right? Because if you're not getting very paid fairly for the work that you're doing, putting in the level of work that you believe is fair for the amount of pay you're getting seems ethical. But others might say that that's not very virtuous of you to not put your full effort in. But we also think that it's kind of unethical and a little ridiculous for employers to expect 100% productivity at all times, right? Like that's not super realistic when it comes to human nature. So it's kind of nice, the free market in this sense, because the the employer, if they don't like the level of work you're doing, they can fire you and hopefully find somebody else to do more work for the same price, right? And that's their judgment call. And if they're fine with the level of work you're doing and fine paying the price that they're paying you, then great. And so then you guys have to work out that agreement. So that's one way to look at it. And that comes into contention mostly, I think, when employers go backwards and they stop giving like benefits or pay. Or I think it's really unfair when employees have gained a lot of experience or knowledge in the area, but their pay stays the same. It's that's when it gets a little tricky, I think, about how much work you're putting in versus what you're getting paid to do. So then they talk about managerial roles, right? And I've already mentioned this, that the managers are, I guess I talked about it as agents, but managers are expected to have expertise on managing, right? They're expected to know how to run a business. They're expected to know certain things about the industry. They're expected to have all this knowledge base, sometimes more than the owners, especially like for big corporations, right? Because those are just a bunch of shareholders. They might not know anything about the industry, honestly. So managers are given a lot of trust and a lot of responsibility to manage the business the way that they feel like it should best be run. And all the shareholders have to trust that the manager is making the right decisions there. And they have to trust that the manager is going to act in the business's best interest and not their own best interests, which is where ethical issues sometimes come up because that's happens a lot where people decide to act in their own self-interest instead of the business self-interest. So they also talk about how some jobs can have roles that outweigh normal ethical considerations. And they get into that in the next section, which is like talking about professional roles like lawyers and accountants and doctors and stuff like that. People with specialized knowledge, they're in professional roles. And sometimes these professional roles, they have responsibilities that outweigh normal ethical considerations. And I think some of the best examples of like, um, not being entirely honest as a lawyer because that goes against the interest of your client, right? So there's in those situations, are the lawyers being unethical or are they're doing their job, what they were hired to do, they're protecting their client's interests. So does that responsibility outweigh the responsibility of being an honest person? And there's questions there, but I think if you were the client, you'd want like your lawyer to represent your best interest, even if that meant them lying, right? So it's depends on your ethics, how you look at it, and it's kind of how society works at the moment. So it's kind of interesting. They talk a little bit about virtue ethics within professional roles. I'm not really sure why, but they talk about how if you are a business, that you can create a culture that is more ethical and more moral, and it will cause more people to be ethical and behave ethically if you really put emphasis on that. So as a corporation, maybe I have a code of ethics, maybe we like review it constantly. We really encourage and reward anybody who comes up with any ethical issues, etc. But that is not how most businesses work, to be honest. Most businesses don't really always want to know about what's going wrong or what they're doing wrong. And that's unfortunate because it usually ends up being really big problems later on that could have been caught sooner and dealt with sooner. But I think the business world is still kind of learning that. And I think a lot of businesses have gotten away with sweeping things under the rug. And so that's the ethical mindset is not always the most highly prioritized thing in any business, even though it should be. So that's why we have business ethics class, because if every business was super ethical, why would we need this? And you guys get to go out in the world and now decide what kind of ethics you're going to impart on it. So good luck. I'm just kidding. Okay. The next section is about managerial responsibility and kind of what managers owe to people in businesses. So they talk first about shareholders because this is kind of the most obvious one for, especially for like big corporations. The job of a business is supposed to be to make profit, and that profit's supposed to go back to shareholders. And so for a long time, the viewpoint was that that should be the priority. Shareholders should always be the priority. And shareholders, just to clarify, are people that own stock in a business. So they own part of the business's assets. They all the shareholders together own the business. So the problem with that is that there are so many different shareholders. How does a manager just just fulfill one shareholder's interest? There's a lot of them, and if they have different interests, like some just want the stocks prices to be really high, some want the business to be really sustainable and long-term good investment. So there's competing interests there. And so a manager can't just go say they're doing the interests of the shareholders if those interests are different. And it's hard if they're only trying to help the shareholders. That means they're looking at profit above all else. And that includes stability. So sometimes a business, I should say almost all the time, a business does better if they look long term and they try to plan long term and they try to be steady and stable and grow stably. I don't know if that's a word, but that they grow at a stable increase instead of just jumping up and then crashing, right? So even though jumping up really fast would be great for shareholders, that's not necessarily in the best interest of stakeholder or shareholders. And they talk about, which I think is really interesting, how CEOs have recently they met and they talked about this problem. They talked about how this culture, this idea of always trying to just do what's best for shareholders isn't what's best for business. And so they've shifted kind of their policy and their view to talk about how sorry, like stakeholders are more important than just shareholders. And so stakeholders are different than shareholders because stakeholders are anybody who's affected by the business. So that includes the customers, the employees, the managers, the board of directors, and the shareholders. The shareholders are also involved, but they're not the only people that the managers are trying to please or the CEOs. Now they're trying to consider everybody who's affected versus just the people who own the company. And I think that's a good look to have, and that's a good take. And I think that's more ethical than just trying to go after profit alone and trying to make sure everybody is included by any decisions that are made. Issues with some manager responsibility include conflicts of interest. So if I'm a manager and I have to make a decision and one option is really going to benefit me and I'm gonna profit off of that maybe, or I'm gonna benefit from that, but the business might suffer, that is conflict of interest. So if I'm personally affected by the outcome of my decision, then I have a conflict of interest there. And so that should be disclosed to the board of directors so that they can weigh in and make sure that the conflict is not going to impact the business negatively. I think an easy example of this is like if you're looking for work to be contracted out, and like my sister owns a business that does this printing and we need a printing job done. And like I would have to disclose that I have a conflict of interest there. Like I have a family member that would benefit greatly from getting this printing contract. And so then it would be best for other people to weigh in on the decision and say, actually look at the pricing and the benefits of using my sister's printing press versus somebody else's. And so that's just something you want to be aware of. As I think at any level of employee, if you notice that your boss might have a conflict of interest, then the higher ups might be interested to know if they're not disclosing that kind of thing. If they are the boss, then that's just questionable behavior. Wow. Okay. Stick with me, guys. I promise we're gonna get through this chapter. So another form of like conflict of interest or issues that managers might face are kickbacks. And this is kind of illegal. So this means like, let's go with the printing company again. So if I have a really big contract, I need to have all these things printed. It's going to be a lot of money that we're going to spend as a business. And a printing company reaches out to me and says, hey, we'd really like that contract. We want to bid for that contract. And then they message me on the side and say, hey, you're going to pay, $10,000 for this printing job. We'll give you personally $2,000 of that you pay us. That would be what's called a kickback. It doesn't necessarily have to be money. It could be things that they offer or discounts or vacations or who knows. It could be a lot of different things, but basically they're offering to give you some of the money that you pay them back. That's why it's a kickback. I think this is also seen in like the pharmacy and medicine industry, because sometimes doctors were getting kickbacks from prescribing certain prescriptions, certain medicines. So, let's say I have a brand medicine and I want, or like, let's say like a birth control or something, right? And I want more people on the birth control I produce, because obviously then I'll make more money. So I go to doctors and I say, hey, for every time you write the prescription for our birth control versus the other birth controls, we'll give you some money. We'll give you a set amount of money. And that'd be a kickback. And I think a lot of pharmacies were doing that. I'm not entirely sure, not up to date on where that's at legally, but that would be an interesting topic to look at for either essay or presentation, looking at kickbacks in the pharmaceutical world. Another one they mentioned is soft money. This is for this almost pretty much like a bribe, but it was legal. And it was looking at giving an agent or somebody you contract money to do research on your company. So let's say if somebody was auditing my company and I'm like, oh, here, I'll pay you this money for you to do a better audit or to do more research or get funds you need to do research on our company, etc. But it ended up showing that that was mostly just used as bribe money, and those people weren't using it to do the research on the company. They were using it for like vacations or stuff that wasn't related. So that was not very ethical. Okay, this section, the next one, trust and loyalty in the workplace. If you think you already read most of this, it's because you did. So it looks like they copied a large section of the previous section on trust again into this section, which I don't know who edits these books, but obviously they don't do a very good job because that's a pretty big mess up. So sorry about that. You get to read about trust again, or you can just skip that whole section and go down to the loyalty, which is actually new content. So the loyalty section, they talk about loyalty as meaning sacrificing something for somebody else, sacrificing your self-interest. And then in a business context, obviously, sacrificing your best interest for that of your employer. And they talk about how that's not really necessary anymore. Because to be honest, businesses will almost always put profits or other things before their employees. And so if they're going to put other things first and not sacrifice for their employees, then why should they expect employees to sacrifice for them? And there's some arguments against this and there's arguments for it, but I think society and businesses have really done away with why you should be loyal to companies, because most businesses, they don't really keep up with a good rate of pay for their loyal employees, right? There's just some try to incentivize it. Like I know the university system has a step program, and so every year you're supposed to go up a step and earn a little bit more, but it's cents. You're not going to make it'll take you years to get a decent pay raise, right? And so that system just encourages people to switch jobs or to go somewhere else, because you can say, oh, I make this much at this job, and you can negotiate a higher pay elsewhere, even in other departments and stuff, if we're keeping to the university model. But when there's other employers looking for employees that are really highly qualified, then it's an easy way to negotiate pay. And if you jump ship and if you leave jobs every few years, you're going to end up with a way higher pay than if you stick around with a single job. And that's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that the system is built like that. And they used to have pensions, right? So that if you stuck around and worked with the company for a long time, your retirement was taken care of, right? You were going to be taken care of when you were done working. And that's not the case anymore. We have, 401ks that we can put money in for retirement, but those stay with us. So we can switch those to any job we're at and get money. And so it's not the same system anymore. And I think we've really switched as a society to not having as much loyalty in the business world, either from businesses to their employees or from employees to the business. So that's unfortunate that that has eroded. But ethically, you have to decide, I think, as a person, if that's within your ethics or not. Looking at your best interests, there's something to be said about, self-sacrificing, but should you do it for an entity that wouldn't do it for you? And that's questionable, especially if there's other people in your life that you're responsible for, So something to consider. They do make a good point that there are cases where just leaving a company could be betraying trust and you could cause a lot of harm by just walking out. And I'm not saying that's not justified in some situations, but it is something to keep in mind is just leaving an ethical decision, or how could I create less harm by leaving? And that's tough. It's tough, especially when you feel like you're not being treated well or if something bad happens and you just want to get out. That's a decision you have to make. So I'm not saying that you should be 100% loyal to every business. I'm saying that it's worth looking at, and you need to determine if that's going to make you the happiest and you're going to feel good after doing that action. Okay. Anyway, on to more ethical responsibilities that employees have. This is an interesting section because they talk about how business is like a game, and therefore there's different ethical rules. And I can kind of see this point in some situations, bluffing and stuff, maybe not lying, but misleading in some cases are a standard practice of business, honestly. It's just something you have to expect. Like if you go to a used car, that's always the example, right? Used car salesman. If you go to a used car lot, they're not going to disclose every single thing that is wrong with that vehicle. They're not going to do it. And you know that though, as a customer, you should know that you can't just go onto a car lot and expect them to be completely 100% upfront and honest about everything that's an issue with that vehicle. That's why you're kind of expected to do your own due diligence, check out the car, maybe pay for a mechanical report on it, etc. So if you know that that's what's expected, then is it unethical that they do that? And probably. I mean, it's never good, I think, to deceive people. Um, but maybe in other cases it's not so bad, like it is playing a game. I'm thinking a lot about other cultures that have more of a bartering system in their market. So they're going to give you a price that's ridiculous and it's not the value of the object or whatever you're buying. And it's expected that you counter and then you guys reach an agreement on the price. And so is that unethical for them to give you a price that's so high? That's just part of the culture. That's what they do. So you're expected to counter and you're expected to go back and forth. So I don't know if that's necessarily unethical, but it is an interesting thought process, I think. And then they talk about how sometimes maybe businesses should lie and it could protect the greater good. Um, Examples are like when stock markets crash or different markets crash, if they try to bluff or kind of deceive people about that crash, then it could help stabilize the market and then the crash won't be so bad and the effects won't be so bad. So, but is that is that okay? That's when you're looking at, Kantian ethics versus utilitarianism. If it's for the greatest good, utilitarians would say, yeah, that's perfectly ethical. And Kantian ethics would say that you shouldn't lie because you can't make that a universal maxim, right? So there's that. Okay, next section, whistleblowing. I hope you guys know what whistleblowing is, but it's basically when an employee talks to the press or leaks information or comes out with information about a business's unethical behavior. It's usually an employee that comes forward and says, "Hey, my business has been doing this, and it's wrong, it's illegal, it's unethical, etc." And this is so tough because honestly, there's rules and there's laws in place about protecting whistleblowers, right? But honestly, trying to work for an employer after you've whistleblown on them is probably very difficult to impossible. So you could be losing out on a really, really good job, and that's your source of income. You have responsibilities to your family. So that's tough. You're putting your whole livelihood on the line just for an ethical act. And that's hard. That's a decision you have to make and you have to look at and decide is it worth it to you? Is it worth it to society to come forward with information? And I talk a little bit about what conditions need to be met to make it ethical. And some people, I think, are a little too fast to whistleblow, right? So they might just jump the gun and go straight to the press with the information that they have. And that's more attention-seeking behavior, I think, than acting ethically. So it's important to be considerate about whistleblowing, I guess. And some things that you consider or some conditions that should be met. There should be a real threat or serious harm that would be done by the company if you don't disclose it. So there's going to be an actual issue. People will be harmed, people will be misled, etc. And by whistleblowing, you are also going to be causing harm to the firm. Like if the business fails because of what you've come forward with, then all those employees lose their job, including you. And so the harm that might be caused to society should outweigh the harm that you're going to cause by whistleblowing. So making sure that there's a real serious threat. The next one is that you should try internal channels first. And I think this is important, but you also have to be careful about it, right? So documenting everything. Do not have this be an in-person conversation or a phone call or anything like that. Make sure it's email and you have an email chain about it. But trying internal channels and talking to your supervisor. Hey, I noticed that this is happening. I don't really know if that's a good thing. Is there a different way we could do it, etc. Trying those internal channels. If they override you, going up to the next level, etc. And also, number 3 is exhausting all the internal procedures you have available to try to prevent that harm from happening. So anything within your power internally to stop it needs to happen first. And then to actually come forward, if all those conditions are met and there's still a problem, then you need to make sure that you have very solid evidence, because if you come forward without any evidence, you're going to get buried and it's not going to be good. You're not going to actually help anyone. And another condition that should be met is you should honestly believe that by coming forward, you are going to be stopping the harm that would be caused. So that's important too. Not just doing it for attention, but doing it to really be honest and try to help people. And finally, we have insider trading, which is where I, maybe as a shareholder of a company, learn some information that the public does not know about, and I choose to buy or sell stock based on that information. This was a big deal when it came to things like COVID, because Congress got briefed on the disease, and a bunch of them went and sold stock or bought stock in different companies that were obviously going to be very related to the pandemic. And so they got to know about this information before everybody else in the public got to know. And so a lot of them profited immensely off of knowing that information. And the argument is that that is not fair, and it shouldn't be. It's not legal technically, but it's really hard to prove and actually get legal consequences for right now. But it's not fair because the market should ideally operate with everybody having the same information available. If you're not doing your research on different companies or whatever, that's your own fault. But if somebody within the company knows something and is able to profit off of that at your disadvantage, then that's not very fair. Especially if, like, let's say you're buying stock, somebody else is selling that stock. So if they're selling that stock because they know the company is going to go bankrupt and they sell you that stock and you buy it and then you lose all your money because the company goes bankrupt, that's not fair to you, and that's not a fair market. So that's kind of why insider trading is not ethical. And I think that just about wraps up this chapter. Sorry, it was a long one, talking about a lot of responsibilities here. So I will see you guys for next week's chapter.